This program is rated PG and may contain mature subject matter. Viewer discretion is advised.
Korea is an ancient nation that has spawned some incredible and unexpected innovations.
If you look at Korea today on the world stage, it certainly has found its place.
Korea has revolutionized what we eat, how we connect.
All of these technologies are really in every crevice of life in developed countries.
And even how we play.
The idea of online gaming was just this completely revolutionary thing.
From centuries-old inventions that still feed us today.
If we didn't have greenhouses in the world, our diets would be awfully bad.
We wouldn't have food security.
To cutting-edge technology that defines our modern world, Korea is a small country with a truly enormous impact.
In the last 70 years, Korea has done what took centuries to accomplish in many parts of the world. They became a technological powerhouse.
Today, we're going to celebrate South Korea's amazing contributions by trying to imagine a world without them. We're conducting a thought experiment in which we strip away vital Korean innovations in pop culture, technology, industry, and food.
Without Korean innovations, the world would be a very different place.
This is History Erased. The world without Korea. Modern Korea emerged from ancient warring kingdoms that eventually united. Located between China and Japan, Korea has always resisted being swallowed up by its powerful neighbors and followed its own path.
Korea is like a shrimp between whales because it's this smaller country amidst the great powers.
So it's always struggled to maintain its own identity.
From the beginning, Korea distinguished itself through educational, scientific, and military innovations.
Korea has a long history of innovation dating right back to ancient times.
In 1950, Korea was torn apart by the competing ideologies of the Cold War, dividing the country into the authoritarian communist North and the democratic capitalist South. And amazingly, South Korea emerged from the devastation of war and transformed into the industrial, high-tech, global power player we know today.
Korea used to be associated with war and poverty, but now it's associated with innovation, creativity, and a global youth culture.
Once one of the poorest countries on Earth, the South Korean economy is now the 11th largest in the world. From humble beginnings, Korean companies have ballooned into corporate behemoths, building mega projects around the world and dominating heavy industry and high-tech manufacturing.
Korea is absolutely one of the cutting-edge places in the world.
And the Korean wave of pop culture has swept over Asia and the rest of the world with billions in revenue.
Korean popular culture has spread far and wide.
Today, during our thought experiment, we'll follow this group of college students and this farmer and observe how they and everyone on the planet are impacted when we remove key Korean contributions to world history one by one. In our global technoculture, people everywhere use the internet for work, travel, and entertainment. We now expect high-speed internet access everywhere we go. And many groundbreaking internet technologies that we now take for granted were born in South Korea.
Online shopping, social media, using your phone to organize everyday life, all of this happened earlier in South Korea than the rest of the world.
The story of Korea's cutting-edge internet begins with a major economic disaster, the Asian financial crisis of 1997. As the South Korean economy shrank and the unemployment rate soared, millions of newly unemployed workers were on the lookout for cheap entertainment, and they found it in internet cafes that were popping up all over Korea.
An internet cafe was for people to check emails and play games and connect with one another.
And they were called PC bang. And they became an essential part of kind of Korean society.
And as internet cafes flourished, the South Korean government and telecom companies made a huge investment in network infrastructure, making Korea the first country in the world with nationwide broadband internet.
For a kid in New York City at the time, where getting online meant dialing up to AOL, South Korea's high-speed internet was just this completely revolutionary thing.
These newly wired internet cafes meant gamers could compete against each other from across the country. Online gaming was born. When the real-time strategy game StarCraft hit the international market in 1998, Koreans were high-speed and ready to play. Online gaming became a national obsession.
And the reason South Korea was such a pioneer of this kind of gaming was that it had the internet infrastructure and such a big user base.
The StarCraft craze led to the creation of the world's first competitive gaming league. The top players became celebrities in Korea, and by the early 2000s, nationally televised gaming tournaments were held in huge stadiums. This gave rise to the worldwide pro gaming phenomenon known as esports.
Esports is a genuine competitive sport. It's really hard to overestimate the reach that this kind of gaming has had.
Online gaming has ballooned in the past decade and is now a multi-billion-dollar industry.
In 2018, the gaming industry generated over $137 billion, more than double the revenue of the Hollywood and the music business combined.
I don't see any way this massive gaming industry could exist today if it were not for South Korea.
And the revolutionary business model known as free-to-play helped upload online gaming into the stratosphere.
It was Korean company Nexon that created the free-to-play model back in 1999.
Free-to-play means people can download or play the game online for free and can opt to make purchases within the game to customize an avatar, unlock new levels, or other in-game purchases.
And what is astounding is how much money this adds up to.
This innovation has inspired others to take this free-to-play model and develop it onto bigger and better games.
Today, the biggest free-to-play game in the world is Fortnite. Fortnite boasts 250 million registered players. Launched in July 2017, it only took 1 year to generate $1 billion solely from in-game purchases. And the very first Fortnite World Cup in 2019 was a watershed moment in esports history. American teenager Kyle Giersdorf, aka Booga, won the top prize of $3 million in front of a sold-out crowd in New York, in a scene reminiscent of esports events pioneered in South Korea. But you don't have to go to a stadium to watch the world's best gamers. In fact, millions of people watch their favorite gamers online thanks to another Korean invention: live streaming.
Some of these players who have celebrity status in the social media world achieve this by streaming live their gameplay.
But it isn't just gamers who stream live. Korean innovators recognized the great potential of the new technology when commercial live streaming first launched in Korea back in 2005.
The Koreans were streaming live a year before YouTube even existed.
What it led to was the democratization of broadcasting. Everybody now can be their own broadcaster.
Live streaming gave rise to the hugely popular Korean phenomenon known as mukbang, where people broadcast themselves cooking and eating to legions of fans.
A lot of uses of live streaming have to do with the closeness that can be developed between a streamer and their audience.
Live streaming has now gone mainstream worldwide. Now anyone with a phone can stream from almost anywhere.
Live streaming has been incorporated into a lot of citizen reporting that's incredibly important for social movements.
Every citizen journalist around the globe owes a debt of gratitude to Korea, which gave this gift of live streaming to the world.
South Korea's amazing internet innovations led to new technologies and new industries that have been embraced worldwide. And as internet culture became global, Korea delivered a viral sensation the likes of which the world had never seen: K-pop.
The summer of 2012 is defined all around the world as the summer of the pop single Gangnam Style.
It was the first video to hit 1 billion views on YouTube. People around the world were copying the dance.
What it did for K-pop is huge. It brought to the attention of people in developed countries the fact that Korea has its own pop music industry.
And the K-pop phenomenon has only gained momentum with the arrival on the world stage of the boy band known as BTS. Since 2017, BTS has been one of the highest grossing musical acts in the world.
There have been a lot of comparisons between BTS and the Beatles. They've become symbols of a kind of internet-connected digital generation. They really are this global group. And in fact, they are probably the largest pop music phenomenon around today.
But as we begin our thought experiment, we're going to strip away these amazing Korean contributions and see how it impacts our modern world. Around the globe, the joy given to millions by Korean pop culture vanishes.
If K-pop didn't exist, the world of popular culture would be a less rich place.
Our modern digital world is forever changed as live streaming melts away. And the largest sector of the entertainment industry crashes as online games cease to exist.
If all of Korea's internet innovations disappeared, we would find ourselves in a media landscape that is decidedly not 21st century.
And as our friends reel from this loss, what will happen to our world as we move on with our thought experiment and wipe out Korean innovations in agriculture? We've begun a thought experiment to highlight Korea's many contributions to world history. Removing South Korean internet-based technology like live streaming and online gaming has wiped out a massive chunk of our modern entertainment industry. And the disappearance of K-pop is another blow to the entertainment landscape, making our world a lot less fun. But as our story continues, we move on to Korean contributions to food and agriculture. We'll see that removing these groundbreaking innovations will have a much more dramatic impact on our world. Korea has a unique culinary culture, distinct from the well-known cuisine of its neighbors China and Japan. And the most important and iconic dish in Korean cuisine is kimchi.
You can't have Korean food without kimchi. No way.
When people think of kimchi, they usually think of napa cabbage that is red and spicy. But there's hundreds of different varieties of kimchi.
This fermented condiment reigns supreme in Korean cuisine. The average Korean consumes 50 pounds of kimchi a year.
Kimchi is so culturally significant in Korea that when they sent their first astronaut up to space, they developed a kimchi that could be consumed in zero gravity.
Long ago, Koreans developed fermented foods like kimchi to preserve vegetables over the winter. And the harsh Korean climate also spurred this revolutionary invention: the greenhouse. With the greenhouse, Korea was the first country in the world to cultivate vegetables and flowers year-round.
Greenhouses in Korea were developed in the 15th century.
Predating greenhouses in Europe by more than 100 years, two remarkable Korean inventions came together to make this game-changing technology possible. The windows were made from a special paper developed by Koreans called hanji.
Hanji paper is made out of mulberry bark and hibiscus roots, and it's extremely durable, breathable, and long-lasting.
This particular paper was very fine. It was a luxury good. It was something valued by the Chinese emperors.
The strong and durable paper could stand up to the harsh Korean winter, and adding oil to the paper made it translucent, allowing sunlight to penetrate. To raise the temperature in the greenhouse so plants could survive, Koreans adapted a technology that they'd already been using for centuries to heat their homes: ondol.
Ondol is an underfloor heating system, and it was developed in the northern parts of the Korean peninsula, and it's been around for a long time, at least 2,000 years.
The ondol system channels smoke from the hearth into hollow channels under the floor, heating stones that radiate heat up through the floor.
One of the outgrowths of this is that it's not until we get into the 20th century when Koreans start using beds and sofas, because they always sat on the floor. That was the warm place.
Even today, most home heating in Korea uses a modern version of ondol. Due to its superior efficiency, underfloor heating systems are being embraced worldwide. In the Korean greenhouse, the ondol system provides the source of heat, while the oiled hanchi paper traps the warm air inside and lets the sunlight shine through, allowing the plants inside to thrive.
Because of this innovation, we can now plant and grow all sorts of crops at any time of the year. So greenhouses have very much increased the productivity, right, of the agricultural sector all around the world.
Increasingly, urban planners incorporate greenhouses into the design of modern cities to shrink the distance from where food is grown to where it is consumed and make food production more efficient.
Greenhouses are one of the most important inventions in the history of the human race because they produce far more food than otherwise would be possible.
And as agricultural yields are increasingly uncertain due to a volatile climate, scientists expect that we'll rely on greenhouse crops even more in the future.
If we didn't have greenhouses in the world, our diets would be awfully bad.
Another agricultural innovation from Korea, essential to our global food supply, is the cultivation of the soybean.
Soybean is indigenous to Northeast Asia, probably northern Korea, and they quickly became a very crucial part of the diet.
The domestication of the soybean predates recorded history, but the earliest evidence of soybeans that resemble the modern varieties we cultivate today comes from Korean archaeological sites dating from 1000 BC.
For much of pre-modern Korea, soy was probably the main source of protein.
Compared to other staple crops like corn, wheat, potatoes, and rice, soybeans are the most nutritious by far, with the highest concentration of protein, fat, calcium, and vitamin C.
Soybeans are an incredibly versatile crop.
They can be processed into tofu and soy milk, or fermented to make soy sauce. But we mostly consume soybeans in the form of generic vegetable oil. Besides agricultural uses, soybeans are also used in soap, cosmetics, plastics, clothing, and even memory foam.
Soybeans now are a major commodity on the world market.
Today, soybeans are the second most valuable U.S. agricultural export after corn. The high value of soybeans is not due to our love of tofu, but due to our love of meat.
A lot of animal feed depends on soybeans for its protein content.
In fact, around 70% of all soybeans harvested are used in animal feed. The production of poultry, pork, beef, and dairy all rely heavily on soybeans.
The soybean is very much central to feeding the entire planet.
As our present food supply relies on the soybean, global food security in the future may depend on another Korean staple, seaweed.
Seaweed is full of nutrients. It's really a kind of superfood, and it's been used in Korean cuisine for hundreds of years.
The earliest accounts of seaweed cultivation come from 15th century Korean books, describing techniques that had been in use for centuries.
Early Koreans realized pretty early on, you've got this rich resource all around the coastline.
And the way it was started was by simply putting sticks into the shallow ocean where the seaweed, laver in particular, would grab to it and grow.
You could harvest seaweed in large quantities, dry it, treat it in various ways, and use this as a very important supplement for your food.
In the 20th century, demand for edible seaweed skyrocketed worldwide, and new techniques were developed to increase production.
South Korean seaweed farms are so massive and the water is so clear they can be seen from outer space.
Global seaweed cultivation is projected to grow because seaweed is highly nutritious and environmentally sustainable. Seaweed absorbs huge amounts of carbon dioxide, lessening the effects of ocean acidification and global warming.
Faced with having to feed 7.5 billion people, seaweed is such a widely available resource. I'm sure we'll be incorporating it into our cuisines all over the world in the decades to come.
As we continue our thought experiment and strip away Korean agricultural and culinary innovations, our world is profoundly impacted.
If greenhouses were no longer functioning, our availability of food would be extremely limited.
As this farmer struggles to save his crops, our friends are about to discover that if greenhouses cease to function and the soybean disappears, a huge portion of our global food supply becomes unavailable.
If soybeans disappeared from the world, we wouldn't have the amount of livestock that we have. We wouldn't have food security.
Around the world, fruits and vegetables begin to disappear from grocery store shelves, and meat becomes scarce.
There could be large-scale famine as people's food supply diminishes, so this could lead to all sorts of disasters.
We risk everything, including starvation.
As the world struggles with the loss of these Korean game changers, things are about to get worse as we remove key Korean innovations in technology. South Korea pioneered some of the internet technologies we take for granted, like live streaming and online gaming. Korea also designed the world's first greenhouse and was instrumental in the cultivation of soybeans, one of the world's most essential crops. When we take these innovations away, the world becomes less connected and the global food supply is threatened.
A world without Korean agricultural innovations means a huge depletion in our ability to produce food. And there would be constant food shortages and riots for what food is available.
As we continue our thought experiment, we're going to look at the worldwide effect of some vital South Korean innovations in high-tech manufacturing. There's no doubt our world is screen-obsessed, from TVs to tablets to mobile phones.
We use screens for work, we use screens to entertain ourselves, we use screens to communicate.
And Korea makes the world's screens.
South Korea is the screen empire.
LG and Samsung are the leading producers of screens in the world. So if you're using any kind of device that requires you to look in a screen, you're using very likely a Korean product.
And this dominance in screen technology is even more remarkable, considering the state of Korea's consumer electronics industry a quarter century ago.
In the early 1990s, the reputation of Samsung products was that they weren't that reliable. So there's a very famous episode where the chairman of Samsung collected all of the defective electronics and destroyed them in front of all the employees. And then told them they must change.
That day, Samsung committed itself to quality and soon emerged as a market leader in consumer electronics and screen technology.
They recognized that there was going to be a huge changeover from the old cathode ray tube. And there was a new technology called liquid crystal displays, and they were able to make these larger, higher resolution screens.
LCD screens were soon replaced by the more energy efficient and cheaper LED technology. And Samsung was at the lead as the #1 manufacturer of flat screen TVs in the world. LG, another Korean company, is #2. Expertise in screen technology led to South Korean dominance in the manufacturing of another modern marvel, the touchscreen.
Touchscreens profoundly altered the way we interact with our technology. They are absolutely fundamental to the functioning of our society and our culture.
We often think of the iPhone as the first touchscreen smartphone, but in fact, the Korean company LG partnered with luxury brand Prada to give us the world's first touchscreen phone, the KE850 in 2007.
The Prada smartphone with a touchscreen was quite groundbreaking and so different.
The KE850 sold 1 million units in the first 18 months, but its success was dwarfed by the release of the first iPhone, and the age of the touchscreen took off. Now, Samsung and LG are the leading manufacturers of touchscreens and even supply the technology to their competitors, including Apple.
I'd be hard-pressed to think of how we would get through a day without using a touchscreen.
And Korea's high-tech dominance goes even deeper, because Samsung is an industry leader in the creation of semiconductors.
South Korea is the largest producer of semiconductors.
Our electronic world is built with semiconductors. Transistors, integrated circuits, and LEDs are all made with semiconducting material.
You can think of semiconductors as basically like steel was to the Industrial Revolution. So it's like the steel of the information revolution. Semiconductors are actually made from sand. And so they can process sand and turn it into these chips that go into the modern world. Your refrigerator has semiconductors. Your phone, your TV, your car is full of semiconductors.
In 2018, Samsung's semiconductor and integrated circuit business helped it surpass Intel as the world's #1 microchip maker, a spot Intel had held since 1992.
I think it would be hard for anyone today to imagine their lives without semiconductors at all.
And this amazing technology is the foundation of a simple yet revolutionary device that debuted in Korea in 1995. The smart card. Every smart card contains a small but sophisticated chip that can store and transmit information without a battery.
The smart card is actually a piece of semiconductor. It's quite clever. It has an antenna, and it's actually able to harvest the power in radio waves to power itself up and also read those radio waves in order to get communication. And it's also able to send a signal back as well, all batteryless.
This technology is now becoming the standard all across public transportation systems in the world. But this was happening in Korea already 15, 20 years ago.
The technology is now integrated into payment cards of all kinds, making transactions and public transportation more efficient.
Transport cards are an incredible tool to really make the infrastructure of a whole city work better.
It's clear that we rely on groundbreaking Korean technologies every day. But in a world where these South Korean innovations are erased, our lives would quickly fall into chaos. As smart cards stop working, cashless transactions become impossible.
If this technology stopped working during the rush hour commute on a Monday morning in a busy city, chaos, total chaos.
Most of the metropolises in the world would shut down.
And as the Korean technology found in TVs, monitors, and touchscreens ceases to function, we are cut off from information and the ability to communicate.
Most of us would just have a very expensive but useless block in our pocket.
As we lose our connection to others and the outside world, the tension and fear mounts.
A world without the Korean technology wouldn't be the modern world that you know today.
The world would be plunged into transport chaos, communication chaos, electronic chaos. The world would cease to work if these Korean innovations disappeared overnight.
As we continue our experiment, things will become even more volatile as we take away essential Korean contributions in heavy industry. South Korean innovations like touchscreens and smart cards are essential tools in our high-tech world. Removing these modern marvels has snarled public transportation and made communication nearly impossible.
All right, everybody, calm down.
These innovations are absolutely fundamental to the functioning of our society. The way we move around the world, the way we interact with each other. I think the world would sort of cease to function as we know it if all these technologies disappeared overnight.
Now the world is much more treacherous for our group of friends. And the crisis will only deepen as we peel away game-changing Korean contributions in heavy industry and engineering. Korean industry rests on a key ingredient: steel.
Steel is obviously very, very important. It's the very first elements you need in order to become an industrialized country.
A government initiative spurred the creation of South Korea's modern steel industry in the 1960s.
Korea is not rich in natural resources, so Korea has had to import the raw materials that it needs.
Lacking resources, Korea focused on developing the world's most efficient steelmaking facilities.
Korea built some of the largest blast furnaces in the world, and so they were able to produce a lot of steel efficiently. And so that's why Korea became a dominant force in making steel.
And since the 1960s, South Korea's super efficient steel production enabled the growth of the country's most important heavy industry: shipbuilding.
If you have this good supply of high quality steel, you can use it to make ships. Shipbuilding was very natural for Korea to develop because it's surrounded on three sides by water.
In fact, Korea's reputation for efficient, quality shipbuilding is centuries old.
In the 13th century, the Mongols conquered all of Korea, And then Kublai Khan says we need to attack Japan. So he instructs the Koreans to construct fleets of several hundred ships. And records suggest up to 75 ships a month were being constructed. Very high quality shipbuilding done very rapidly.
Korea's stellar reputation for shipbuilding was resurrected in the 1970s.
The timing was perfect for South Korea because it was building ships right as the global economy was taking off. And the global economy depends on the ability for us to ship things reliably from one corner of the world to the other. If you've ever owned anything that has come from any other part of the world, chances are it was delivered by a Korean-built ship. South Korea has been at the forefront of building the backbone of this infrastructure that has made globalization possible.
Korean shipbuilders don't just make cargo ships, but also high-tech specialty ships, like liquid natural gas carriers.
Liquefied natural gas ships are highly specialized ships for moving natural gas around the world.
LNG carriers deliver fuel used to heat homes and supply electricity-producing gas plants all over the world. And more than 2/3 of the world's LNG fleet were built in South Korea.
The whole world relies on natural gas, and it's going to be a Korean tanker that's going to deliver it to you.
For the last 2 decades, Korea has jockeyed with its neighbors, China and Japan, for shipbuilding dominance. And in 2018, South Korea reclaimed its title as the #1 shipbuilding nation in the world. Korea's high-tech steel manufacturing and heavy industry know-how has also contributed to breathtaking achievements in mega construction.
South Korea has got some huge civil engineering firms, and they've been winning world contracts for a long, long time.
Historians attribute much of Korea's success in these industries to the cultural emphasis on education that stretches back centuries.
Education is considered extremely important in Korean society.
South Korea has spent a lot of energy and capital on investing in its people.
South Korean men are required to serve in the military, but an exception is given to the best and brightest science and engineering students.
Without that policy, I'm not sure as many Korean males would have chosen to study science, engineering, or math.
Korea has produced some of the best engineering minds on Earth, a human resource that helps Korean corporations win contracts for some of the world's most jaw-dropping mega projects.
With their combination of high technology and incredible people, they've been able to win these contracts and make truly amazing things.
South Korean firms have secured deals to build oil refineries in the Middle East, massive desalination plants that provide fresh water for millions, and the world's longest suspension bridge.
It spans the Dardanelles Strait in Turkey, and it's due to be finished in 2023.
And Korean companies have helped construct some of the most impressive architectural marvels of the modern world.
The Petronas Towers in Kuala Lumpur. The Sky Bridge, which links the two towers, was made completely in Korea, shipped in its entirety, and then winched up. Burj Khalifa is the world's tallest building, striking over the Dubai skyline. It stands at 830 meters. If you have an architectural dream you want to make a reality, you're going to go to a South Korean company.
As we continue our thought experiment and erase more Korean innovations, the global crisis worsens. The loss of Korean shipbuilding rocks the world economy as thousands of cargo ships don't make their destination.
We would see an economic collapse worldwide.
And as Korean natural gas carriers disappear, fuel for cooking and home heating becomes more scarce.
If natural gas was no longer being shipped by Korean vessels, we would have an energy crisis on our hands. Not only would people not be able to heat their homes, but manufacturing plants and offices would have to shut down.
It would affect millions of people.
Electricity-producing natural gas plants begin to go offline, causing blackouts worldwide.
It would be catastrophic.
As this terrible new reality shakes the world, things become even more chaotic as key Korean advances in defense and security are erased. The removal of Korean innovations in agriculture, technology, and shipbuilding has threatened the global food supply. disrupted transit and communications, and destabilized the energy grid, plunging our world into darkness, hunger, and fear. And as we resume our thought experiment, this group of friends will be faced with an even greater crisis as we imagine a world without Korean innovations in defense and security. Over the course of its long history, Korea has been invaded countless times.
Korea was frequently at risk of invasion by its more powerful neighbors. So developing national defenses for the country was really important.
For a country surrounded by water on three sides, naval defenses are essential. And one Korean invention is considered by many historians to be the first armored battleship in the world, the turtle ship.
The turtle ships are armored ships, and they played a crucial element in Korea's naval defenses in the late 15th century.
The turtle ship was covered with iron plates and spikes, and the idea was this would prevent the enemy from being able to board the ship easily, and it also provided protection against gunfire.
These well-protected ships also had impressive offensive capabilities.
Turtle ships were lined with cannons on the side, 11 each, and they had a dragon's head on the front that could either spew out fire or a cannonball. The general purpose of the ship was to be highly maneuverable in waters and able to ram the enemy ships.
When the Japanese Navy invaded Korea at the end of the 16th century, a much smaller fleet of turtle ships repelled the invasion. And leading the Koreans was legendary national hero Lee Sun-shin.
He was a genius naval commander who won every battle he was engaged in.
Lee Sun-shin used the turtle ships to overcome a much larger Japanese force with great success.
Some believe that Korean turtle ships were an early inspiration for the ironclad battleships that emerged among the great naval powers of the 19th century. And when it comes to being centuries ahead of the times, Korea can take credit for another innovation: the world's first women police officers, known as the Tamo.
Here we've got another sort of unique social innovation of Chosun Korea in creating this elite force of powerful women to keep order in the community.
Korean society strictly forbade most interactions between men and women, so this female police force was created to enforce laws among the women of the upper class.
The Damo were used to interrogate women or to investigate cases of adultery or crimes involving women.
The Tamo were expected to have exceptional strength and were trained in martial arts. They were also expected to hold their liquor.
One of the requirements for the Damo was to be able to drink alcohol, in this case 5 bowls of rice wine. It showed that they needed to be tough enough to carry out their duties, even if they were drinking.
And the Tamo aren't the only example of tough fighting women in Korean history. During the Japanese occupation of Korea at the turn of the 20th century, one woman emerged as a national hero.
Yoon Hee-sung was a female militia leader fighting against the Japanese. In 1907, she formed her own all-female militia and carried out guerrilla attacks on the Japanese army. Having an all-female militia in a patriarchal society like Korea was at the early 20th century is really something remarkable.
Fighting foreign invaders is a constant theme in Korean history. And in 1866, an attack by a Western power spurred a Korean invention now used all around the world: the bulletproof vest.
The world's first bulletproof vest was invented in Korea in 1867. This was in response to an invasion by the French.
The Koreans were caught off guard by the sheer power of the French rifles, leading to the creation of this new type of armor.
The Korean military at the time experimented with a kind of armor that can stop bullets by creating this vest that had 30 layers of cotton.
Modern bulletproof vests work on the same principle as the original Korean design, using many layers of high-tech fibers instead of cotton. As a bullet passes through each layer, it loses velocity, dissipating its destructive power. Today, bulletproof vests are used by nearly every modern military and police force in the world.
Imagine what would happen if All in an instant, bulletproof vests stopped working.
Hey, give me your money. Give me the cash.
Without the bulletproof vest, even routine police action would be much more dangerous.
Give me the cash.
Please, stop!
As we near the end of our thought experiment and this essential Korean innovation disappears, police officers become extremely vulnerable, and our friends find themselves in a world on the brink of anarchy. Modern bulletproof vests work on the same principle as the original Korean design, using many layers of high-tech fibers instead of cotton. As a bullet passes through each layer, it loses velocity, dissipating its destructive power. Today, bulletproof vests are used by nearly every modern military and police force in the world.
Imagine what would happen if all of this vests stopped working.
The world has been torn apart by the loss of South Korea's game-changing innovations.
Our global economy could be paralyzed. All chaos would break loose.
Without greenhouses and the soybean, mass starvation looms as crops fail and meat is scarce. People panic as access to information and communication becomes impossible. Critical fuel distribution fails, causing widespread blackouts. And with the disappearance of bulletproof vests, police officers are less able to protect the public and themselves. But thankfully, as our experiment draws to a close, things go back to normal, and Korean innovations return to the world. The bulletproof vest helps keep law enforcement safe while protecting our streets. Power and heat come back on as natural gas infrastructure is restored. The global food supply is replenished. Screens of all kinds once again deliver information and allow us to connect. And Korea's cultural achievements enrich our lives once more. With our experiment complete and Korean innovations restored, we look ahead to what the future holds for Korea.
Given the great innovation in South Korea in the last 50 years, it's hard to fathom what the next 50 years holds for us.
Korea is on the cutting edge of many technologies that will literally build the future, like the ultralight steel known as gigasteel.
This stuff is over twice as strong as other steels that are being used in construction today. It means we can build buildings that are stronger, lighter, and we can build even taller than before. And this is really going to pave the way for the skyscrapers of the future.
South Korean cities will serve as the template for urban planners all over the world as Korea pushes the frontiers of civil engineering, smart technology, and the world's fastest internet.
And Korean urban designers have been thinking hard about this, a city of the future. Many of the problems that are ubiquitous to cities around the world today could conceivably disappear through much more efficient management of these problems using advanced internet and other technologies.
Korea has the highest penetration of automation in the world and is developing cutting-edge robots for military, domestic, and medical uses, including cancer-fighting nanobots.
When it comes to South Korea, you think technology and innovation, and that couldn't be more true than when it comes to robotics.
The global wave of Korean pop culture shows no signs of slowing down.
K-pop represents a kind of digitally connected youth culture. It's really this massive social network that's getting bigger and bigger.
And Korea's resilience, innovation, and leadership will continue to inspire people in other nations around the world.
Koreans have achieved this high level of coordination and cooperation between government, business, and society, and I think that's the path of the future.
What South Korea shows is that you can be an influential, important country in the world by relying on cultural capital and innovation and technology. I have a feeling that South Korea is going to be driving innovation for decades to come.